You are listening to The Investor Way with Sam Ball and Jonathan McEwen. If you enjoy the show, please subscribe and follow us on Twitter at TIW Tweets.
Hello, welcome to The Investor Way with me, Sam Ball. It's the 15th of June 2024, and I'm rejoined today by our special guest, the Sloth Investor. So, for anyone who's not familiar, the Sloth Investor has previously been on the podcast, and what I've done is I've posted the previous interview as the last episode before this one. So, if you do want to go and listen to it, it's probably best to listen to that one first. But for anyone that doesn't want to listen to the full previous interview, could you just give a brief introduction into how you got interested in investing and, how you got to where you are to date?
Hi, first of all, thanks again, Sam, for inviting me on. It's a pleasure to be on the Investor Way podcast. And oh gosh, how did I get started with investing? If I'm honest with you, I was someone who came from a family of non-investors. There was no prior history of investing in my family, none whatsoever. And for me, as a young person, particularly my late teens, investing never even entered the realm of my thinking. It wasn't something that I was particularly interested in, I'd been introduced to. And it was only really after speaking to my father-in-law, I guess at the age of I want to say 27, 28, my late 20s, when I first started to become interested. He would gradually, I guess you could say he wore me down really, but he gradually started to talk to me about investing. And I guess those initial few chats, I still wasn't quite interested. I guess you could say I had a bit of an imposter syndrome with regards to investing. I thought, it wasn't for someone like me, someone from kind of a relatively humble background, Mr. Joe Average. And then gradually I did become more interested. He spoke to me about the importance of time and patience and why it's so important to grow your money. So I guess it was talking to my father-in-law, allied with also reading a really profound book, a book called Millionaire Teacher by Andrew Hallam. So reading that book was also a major catalyst for me in terms of getting me started on my investing journey. So I guess they're the two principal figures, my father-in-law, John, and reading Andrew Hallam's book, Millionaire Teacher.
Do you talk about where the Sloth Investor came from? Because investing it's a hobby that does have quite a lot of animals associated with it. You've got bulls, you've got bears, you've got pigs. You don't get quite as many sloths though.
No, exactly. Yeah, and actually in the blurb on the back of my book, that's actually the first sentence. I state, step aside, bull and bear. The humble sloth is the best animal to characterize successful investing. And you're right, we don't often really hear the sloth being associated with personal finance. But for me, I first came across the sloth because after reading Andrew Hallam's book, Millionaire Teacher, which I just mentioned, I kind of went on a bit of a book binge. I started to read a ton of books on personal finance. I even got into kind of shareholder letters, particularly the shareholder letters of Warren Buffett and his company, Berkshire Hathaway, on an annual basis releases these annual, shareholder letters, and became a bit of a Buffett geek, if you like. And in his 1990 letter to shareholders, he's got this great quote. It's lethargy bordering on sloth remains the cornerstone of our investing style. So again, it's lethargy bordering on sloth remains the cornerstone of our investing style. So I love that. So that really explains why I believe that, the sloth is the best animal to characterize successful investing. And it's what I always talk about, the fact that in most realms of life, it's effort, it's energy, it's activity that brings with it great reward. So I'm thinking about if you're learning to play a musical instrument, if you're looking to kind of perfect your golf swing or improve your serve in tennis, or even, I don't know, if you're a really young person practicing for an exam. We're always taught from a young age, aren't we? Naturally, it's effort, it's energy, it's activity. But that's one of the great counterintuitive points about investing. I guess I'll mention a few in this podcast. One of the key counterintuitive points about investing for me is that it's actually inactivity that brings with it great reward. And that's something that I really, really, again and again, try to kind of hammer home within my book. The fact that, it's this hands-off, less is more approach to investing that really brings with it great reward, hence the name of my investing brand, the Sloth Investor. So yeah, that's why for me, the humble sloth, it really is the best animal to characterize successful investing.
So did the Sloth Investor come into existence first, or were the 5 bedrock principles already developed? And could you just briefly explain what those are?
Yeah, that's a good question, really, because I guess the more and more I read about investing, the more conversations I had with my father-in-law, videos I watched, conversations with colleagues and other people that are interested in investing. I started to synthesize all that I'd learned. And I guess the 5 bedrock principles are kind of a synthesis of what I learned. It's a good question as to what actually came first. Was it the animal? Was it the bedrock principles? I guess I really did. When reading reading that quote, reading that section of Buffett's 1990 letter to shareholders, I really was taken with that kind of concept of sloth, hardly doing anything, being inactive. And then I guess for a while I'd had these two or three principles bubbling under, things such as simplicity and low fees. And if I'm honest with you, it's hard to kind of pinpoint what exactly came first. Was it the bedrock principles? Was it the sloth? Was it, is it the chicken or the egg? But yeah, I mean, my 5 bedrock principles do spell each of the letters in the word sloth relates to one of my bedrock principles. So we've got S, simplicity, L, low fees, O, owning the world, T, time, and H, headstrong. And so ultimately, I'd be happy to go into more detail of each of those if you'd like to. But yeah, I mean, those five bedrock principles really represent a synthesis of all that I've learned about investing. Yeah, so they came about through just like so much reading, so many conversations. That's how, those bedrock principles came about. I'd be happy to kind of dive deeper into those as well as the podcast progresses.
Yeah, I think they'll come up sort of on their own naturally. I'm just conscious
sure.
that obviously we did go through them all in the last one, which
Yeah,
hopefully people
definitely.
have already listened to. And I'm assuming it's not the kind of thing that changes with time.
Absolutely. Yeah.
There's certainly still 5 of them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Since the last time you came on as well, so you have started your own podcast.
Yeah.
So it's obviously it's a different type of podcast to what we do, where we are obviously, I know we do these interviews, but we are typically more sort of news and events based. Whereas I think yours is, it is focused on those bedrock principles and those sort of foundations of investing. Could you just talk about how the podcast came about and what it's about, really?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I actually work in international education. So I work abroad in Hong Kong. I'm originally from the UK. I'm from Kent. And I live and work in Hong Kong. I have done for around about the last 6 years. It's funny because I guess the principles and this whole notion of investing like a sloth came up around about 2019. That's when I first started to kind of work on my book, really, spring of 2019. And then I think it was the following year, maybe just as COVID was hitting, I went on Twitter and I started to put, some information on Twitter, images of the sloth, my bedrock principles. I tweet quite regularly, I really would. And I start to really take off. I guess after a month or so, I had several thousand followers. Then some of my colleagues as well, particularly those who are really quite enamored of investing as well, said, hey, this is pretty good, pretty impressive. It seems like what you have to say about investing, these 5 bedrock principles really resonate with other people, particularly in the States, it seemed, in North America. I had, for example, several people from the Motley Fool follow me and so on. And then one of my colleagues, Jay, he actually said to me, hey, have you thought about recording a podcast? And if I'm honest with you, that is something that had never entered the equation. I'm not particularly great at tech. I'm definitely an ideas guy, enjoy writing, hence the book. But when it comes to tech, that's my Achilles heel, if you like. So Jay, eventually he cajoled me into recording a podcast episode. I kind of went along with Jay to a studio that's not far from where we live. I had about 5 or 6 bullet points hastily written on a sticky note, and the episode actually went well. And actually looking back, I'm a bit of a perfectionist by nature. Looking back, re-listening to the podcast, even I think that evening, I thought to myself, I wish I'd used this quote. I wish I'd referenced that investor and so on. And after that, I feel like the episodes became a lot more polished. So yeah, episodes 1 to 5 of my podcast, the Sloth Investor podcast, dives into each of those bedrock principles. And as the podcast has grown, we've been able to actually attract quite a few other personal finance authors. I guess notably J.L. Collins, who's an author that I really admire a great deal. He's most famous, I guess, for The Simple Path to Wealth. Eric Balchunas, who wrote The Bogle Effect. Brian Feroldi, who wrote Why Does the Stock Market Go Up? And I guess last but not least, Andrew Hallam, who I mentioned at the very beginning. He wrote Millionaire Teacher and several other books. So yeah, it's been great that I guess had spoken to at least 6 or 7 personal finance authors, and yeah, that's been great. We haven't done one before actually because I've been so busy in 2024 in terms of helping to get the book out there, marketing and so on and so forth. So I guess my YouTube channel has taken a bit of a backseat, but no, it's something I've grown in confidence with as well, and it's something I've enjoyed as well. The podcast, yeah.
So I have listened to a few of the episodes. I think you got your invest. Is it the Investing Hall of Fame?
Yeah, that's one as well. That was fun.
So have you interviewed? Have any of your interviewees been in the Investing Hall of Fame? I'm assuming Andrew Hallam has to have been.
Yeah, to be fair, one of our early episodes was we do these things, Sloth Investor Hall of Fame, i.e. investors that played a key role in shaping my 5 bedrock principles, for example. So obviously Buffett, the late Jack Bogle, and Andrew Hallam. And so, yeah, we were fortunate to get Andrew Hallam for our Christmas podcast a few years ago. And yeah, that was pretty cool. And he actually spoke about a time when he went to Berkshire Hathaway's annual general meeting several years ago in Omaha. Andrew Hallam was an international school teacher himself. And in the podcast episode, he speaks a great deal about, his students were kind of cajoling him, why don't you go try to meet Warren Buffett and so on. And Andrew Hallam, he said, oh, no, what chance do I have? I'm just like a humble international school teacher. He wrote a letter to Berkshire Hathaway. And in the end, he was able to get there over to Omaha. He met Buffett. He met Charlie Munger. Visiting that day in Omaha was Bill Gates as well. So, so he managed to meet that trio, Buffett, Munger, and Bill Gates. So, but yeah, Andrew Hallam, I'd say, is a key influence upon me. And I reference him several times in the book. And what I like about him as well is that there are some parallels to him and myself. So he comes from a relatively humble background like myself, was someone who, came from a family of non-investors. And it's funny, actually, he got his start in investing by speaking to kind of, I use in quotation marks, a millionaire mechanic. I'd be happy to talk more about that later. But I always talk about those sliding doors moments. I don't happen to be someone who's a real fan of romantic comedies. My wife is, but I always think back to that movie. I think it's the late 90s. Gwyneth Paltrow and John Hannah, I think it's Sliding Doors. And I guess that for him was a sliding doors moment for Andrew Hallam, meeting a millionaire mechanic. So yeah, it's been good to kind of have we've got varied content on the Sloth Investor YouTube channel, but the Sloth Investor Hall of Fame has been a popular one.
Could you talk a bit more about the mechanic bit that you referenced earlier?
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, so Andrew Hallam, he was a 19-year-old. He was, he was originally from Nottingham in UK, but he moved to Canada in his teens, and he was working at a bus depot in British Columbia in Vancouver at the age of 18, 19, just a summer job, like many of us have, I guess, when we were teenagers, washing the buses down, trying to earn a bit of extra money here and there. And one day at lunch break, some other people said to him, hey, you see that guy over there, he's a millionaire mechanic, and Andrew Hallam said, okay, yeah, whatever. Yeah, millionaire mechanic. What are you trying to pull? And a guy said to him, no, honestly, he is a millionaire mechanic. You should go and talk to him, So Andrew Hallam, I guess he had that binary choice there. Should I take heed of what these guys are saying? Or should I just get on with what I'm doing on my lunch break and so on? But wisely, he actually went over to speak to the millionaire mechanic, and the millionaire mechanic, he actually asked him a question. So, hey, if I gave you $10,000, what would you do with it? That's what he asked Andrew Hallam. And Andrew Hallam, he retells this in several of his podcast appearances, I mean, podcasts. But Andrew Hallam thought about it and he said, well, if you gave me $10,000, I would probably put it towards my own education. And the mechanic replied, that's acceptable. That's fine. And later on, the millionaire mechanic, he said to Andrew Hallam, if you'd said something like buy a new car stereo, designer clothes, and so on, I wouldn't have bothered talking to you. That would have been the end of it. But because you kind of gave me a sensible response, that's why I wanted to get to know you a bit more. And yeah, I don't know all the ins and outs of the story, but essentially that kind of millionaire mechanic taught Andrew Hallam about compound interest, the importance of investing from a young age, not wasting money. So yeah, I love that. And again, early on in my book, I reference 3 ordinary individuals that became extraordinary investors. In fact, it's in chapter 2, Once Upon a Time. So I mentioned, for example, a teacher, a mechanic, and a secretary. And that's a key point that I make throughout my book, is that I think too many people think that the world of investing is kind of off limits and it's a numbers game, too tricky, too much jargon and so on. But a point I want to make, and I make throughout my book again and again, is that it shouldn't be off limits. It's for anyone, whether you're a teacher, mechanic, secretary, whoever you are, investing can be for anybody. Yeah.
Is there anything else then that you've learned from the guests on your podcast, just before we do move on to the book?
Yeah, that's a great question. I particularly love speaking to a chap named Eric Balchunas. So Eric Balchunas wrote The Bogle Effect. And of course, the Bogle effect, I'm sure many of your listeners know, but the Bogle effect, refers to Jack Bogle, who was the founder of Vanguard and kind of was really responsible for creating the world's first index fund in the mid-70s. And I thought I knew a fair bit about Jack Bogle and Vanguard and so on. But Eric Balchunas and I, we had a really in-depth discussion about Bogle and his concepts and ideas. So Balchunas, in our conversation, he references this whole notion of relative predictability. And what that means, it's this term that Jack Bogle came up with, whereby he said that index investors generally, and this has been borne out by the recent data of the last 5 to 10 years, they tend to behave quite well because of the relative predictability of the stock market. They inherently seem to recognize that, yes, there are going to be those intermittent periods of volatility where the stock market goes down due to geopolitics or, oil crisis, whatever it might be. But generally, index fund investors have been shown to behave pretty well. And it's all because of that relative predictability, really. Balchunas as well, in our interview, he also referenced this kind of, I think it's an Aesop's fable story of the hedgehog and a fox, the hedgehog and a fox. So he makes this point. So Bogle was keen on this story, the hedgehog and a fox, whereby foxes naturally are quite cunning, quite shrewd, quite clever, lots of tricks up their sleeve. But a hedgehog knows one great thing. So when a fox, for example, tries to attack a hedgehog, the hedgehog will simply kind of roll into a ball, deter the fox, and a fox will obviously kind of move away. You know, the spikes of the hedgehog will cause it to move away. So even though the hedgehog's got that one trick, that is enough to kind of prove it to be successful. And ultimately, I think the point Bogle was trying to make there was that you can have so many intricate ways of investing. You can kind of talk about derivatives and like time in the market and so on and so forth. But if you know that one great simple way to invest, just keeping it ever so simple, investing in a low fee, broadly diversified index fund, that is the approach that has been successful for so many people, and I guess will be in the future. So yeah, I mean, if anyone's keen to check out that episode, I think Edgar Balchunas actually probably explains it in more detail and more accurately in our podcast episode with him. But yeah, I love that Aesop's fable of the hedgehog and the fox. I really like that. And I guess going back to J.L. Collins, who wrote The Simple Path to Wealth, that was another great guest on my podcast. He's also incidentally written the lead endorsement for my book. It's on the front cover. J.L. Collins was great to chat to. He speaks about this concept of FU money, and I'll leave it to your imagination and the imagination of your audience as to what the F stands for. But he speaks a great deal about this whole concept of FU money and what investing can do and the opportunities it brings you and so on. So, you know, it's not as if I wasn't aware of kind of like the freedom that money can bring you and so forth and so on. I was, but I just like the whole notion of FU money. I thought that was quite interesting as well. So yeah, J.L. Collins, I think he's someone who's become really widely known. And for anyone who's not so familiar, you can check out his talk at Google. He was invited by Google several years ago to speak to their employees, and I think that talk has got something like 1.7 million views the last time I checked. So yeah, that was another great chat. That was our Christmas episode last year as well. Yeah, 2023.
So you've mentioned the book a few times. Again, that's new since we last spoke. So how did the book come about, and what's it about, and sort of who's it aimed at?
Yeah, great question. So for me, really, I guess it stems from a sense of frustration, and it also stems from the fact that I've always had the idea in my mind of perhaps potentially being a writer. I've always been a voracious reader from being young, from a young age. But I guess going back to that first point, it's a sense of frustration because I just feel like I really wanted, without sounding cliche, to write a book that I wish I had been given at the age of 18, 19. So there's been so many great books written over the years. I mentioned Millionaire Teacher, A Simple Path to Wealth. I love books like A Wealth of Common Sense by Ben Carlson. But for me, many personal finance books are rich on theory, but often they lack utility. So what I'm trying to do with my book is kind of create a book that, yes, there's a theory behind my philosophy, my investing philosophy, but also I want it to be a book of utility. So I specifically outline, model portfolios, whether you're a Brit, American, Canadian, Aussie, whether you're based in Europe, wherever you are in the world, I actually provide model portfolios for anyone, wherever you are in the world, that you can create in a sloth-like fashion. I started to write it in 2019. And it's funny actually because my mother-in-law came to visit us here in Hong Kong. My wife took them out for a day of, tourist, sightseeing. I was all at home alone, and I thought, you know what, let's make a start. So I just happened to write a couple of thousand words that day. That was spring 2019. Kind of left it. I actually didn't do anything more that year. And circling back to the following year, now obviously 2020, 2021, I think none of us need to remind you, but those were the peak COVID years, and particularly in Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, they had really draconian laws with regards to COVID. We were not able to travel. So essentially, we didn't leave the country in 2020, 2021. We were stuck here in Hong Kong. So as much as I think people here in Hong Kong, we hated COVID, in a way, it was a blessing in disguise for me because summer 2020, summer 2021, that's when the bulk of the book was written. I'd estimate I wrote those consecutive summers about 15 to 20,000 words each summer. I really just got my head down. Yes, I had commitments. I had wife and I looking after the kids. They're quite a bit younger then as well. But when I could find a spare moment, it was really useful to have that deep reservoir of time to kind of plow on with the book. And yeah, I mean, I left it a little bit in 2022, and then I kind of finished it off last summer, 2023, when I was in the UK for a bit of time there, and finally finished there. So I guess you could say it was kind of a 4-year process from spring 2019 to summer 2023. And yeah, I mean, it was enjoyable. It's funny actually, because my wife was saying to me the other day, how on earth did you do it? You know, it's not something that I would do. She doesn't particularly enjoy writing, but I actually quite enjoyed the process. And for anybody that's considering writing a book, I think just when you actually sit yourself, plonk yourself in front of a laptop, you know, new ideas are generated. So that process of writing, you do find that new ideas literally will come into your mind as you're sat there at the coalface, if you like, you know, as you're typing. So yeah, it was an enjoyable process, if not a slog.
So you mentioned model portfolios in there. Could you,
Yeah.
are these with regard to asset allocation and like, you know, for example, are they different for different ages? Would you be able to just go into a bit more detail about how you've constructed those?
Yeah, so in terms of my third bedrock principle, I'm a firm advocate of owning the world. So it's something I know I touched upon in our last podcast discussion, but I am someone, I always say to people, you know, none of us have a crystal ball. None of us know which particular stock or sector or state is going to do particularly well. So that's why I'm a really firm advocate of a globally diversified approach to investing. And so what I've done, let's take the Brits, for example. What I've done is I provided model portfolios. For example, if you are someone based in the UK and if you want to kind of go down a route of keeping investing simple, I've actually provided specific funds that will enable you to invest in a low fee, broadly diversified manner. I've even spoken about bonds to an extent, but I fully get that there may be some people for whom, you know, bonds, perhaps they may not find them necessary, but I do also provide the option if people find that necessary. And likewise, if you're an Aussie, an American, Canadian, likewise for those guys, I also provide model portfolios. So let's take America, for example. I think it's VT. I'm pretty confident in saying it's VT. VT is a Vanguard, globally diversified fund that Americans can invest in. And again, this goes back to what I mentioned before about utility. I want my book to be specific, so someone can literally pick up the book. Doesn't matter where you are in the world, and you can kind of go to that particular section of book. I think it's chapter, and I've got the book right in front of me here. It is chapter 8, sample portfolios for Sloth Investor, it's called. And you can specifically see what portfolio you could build. I also do stress the point, though, that for me, when it comes to investing, I make a bit of a comparison to like our taste palette. So I'm coming back to UK in a few weeks' time, and something I'm looking forward to is just Indian food. So I absolutely love Indian food. I love spicy food. My wife and kids, not so much. So when we go for a curry, we always, I always tend to go for the spicy food. And likewise, I think when it comes to investing, we've all got our own unique palette. So I think the danger today is that too many people behave in perhaps a bit of a zealot-like way. They might say, hey, this is how everyone should invest. And it's kind of some people who advocate index funds can very much be like that. Or you get the other crowd who are like growth stocks or value stocks. I'm more nuanced in my approach, I guess. So while I do ultimately advocate, index funds, especially for beginner investors and those who want to spend, no more than an hour a year in investing, I'm someone as well who definitely, sees potential for people if they want to kind of like, I don't know, allocate 10 to 15% of their portfolio in growthy stocks if they like, or if someone's got an uncle who works for a particular tech company and they've spoken to their uncle and they feel like, yeah, I want to allocate 2-3% of my portfolio to that individual stock, then so be it. But yeah, broadly speaking, because my book is aimed at beginner investors and the tagline, the slogan of the book is simplifying investing for all, what I try to reiterate again and again and again is that for the majority of investors, investing in a low fee, broadly diversified index fund is the approach for so many investors. So it's that kind of utility that I'm aiming for my book.
So when was the book actually released then, and where can people find it?
Yeah, great question. So it's actually released June 28th this year. So June 28th, 2024. You can already see on Amazon UK, people will be able to see, you can buy it as a paperback, of course. You can buy it as an ebook. It's also started to become available for pre-order, I believe, on Amazon Japan, Amazon Canada, Amazon France. Spoken to a publisher. I was quite naive about this, to be honest with you, Sam. I actually naively thought, once it becomes available on Amazon, that's it. It'll be available on every single Amazon on the same day. That's not quite how it works. So speaking to my publisher recently, it will become available on Amazon.com, the main US site, soon. Amazon Canada and so on. So gradually it'll become available. I've seen it's available on Barnes & Noble, for example, in North America. But yeah, certainly for those of you in your audience who are listening in the UK, it's definitely, you can view it on amazon.co.uk, the paperback version. You can see the artwork for it. And it's also available to download on Kindle as well.
So how did you go from, obviously I know you talked about the story of how you ended up writing the book over sort of various summers. How did you then go about from, you've got your written book, to
Yeah.
it's now being published? What was that process like?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I am someone who, relishes writing. I love writing a book, but in terms of publishing, that was something that was wholly unfamiliar to me. So I just did quite a bit of research really in terms of publishing companies that had good reputations. I looked up reviews and so on and so forth. And the publishing company I've chosen is Troubadour. They've been really helpful every step of the way. Again, they garnered lots of positive reviews, and they've just been really beneficial in terms of the fact that they have created a really fantastic book cover. I've had so many positive reviews and comments about the book cover. It's an image of, a sloth hanging upside down on a stock line, green stock line that eventually, goes up. It's a really cool cover I'm quite proud of. So they helped me to kind of put that idea into practice. And just in terms of the typesetting, proofreading, I would not have had any clue about the complexities of that. So it's actually been surprising to me. I guess the book was finished, I want to say around about mid-July of last year. And I naively thought, well, I tend to come back to you, okay, at Christmas. Perhaps I could release the book then, get it out in time for the Christmas market, Christmas present, of course. And they said, no, it can be quite a lengthy process. You're looking at least, kind of, I don't know, 8 to 10 months. So that surprised me. But, it really is quite a lengthy process. There's the back and forth of like edits and so on, proofreading, copy editing, getting it out there into foreign markets. So it really is quite an exhausting process, but it's been educational for me as well because it's something that I knew very little about. But yeah, if anyone is looking to kind of publish a book, I'm not on commission. I do recommend Troubadour. They're based in Leicestershire, and they've been really helpful. They've been really beneficial.
How did you end up picking Troubadour then? Did you speak to multiple publishers, or did you sort of do some research and decide that was kind of the one you wanted, or what was that process like?
Yeah, I spoke to several. Well, to be fair, I did quite a bit of research. I really did quite a bit of research, particularly now. Forgive me if I'm pretty sure it's Glassdoor. So Glassdoor, for example, there are various other review sites that I checked out. I want to say the majority of the reviews are really beneficial. Invariably, I want to see what other authors said about them. And yeah, Troubadour, a really polished company, a professional website. They've also helped to publish other personal finance books before. I was pretty impressed with, the front covers that they've designed. Again, my strength is not in graphic design, so I really wanted to kind of employ a company that could help me out in that respect. So yeah, I guess it was for me taking some time last summer to kind of really do an in-depth kind of exploration of various companies in the UK that could help me to publish a book. And Troubadour came up trumps, for want of a better phrase. Yeah, they came up trumps. They were really good.
Given the amount of time it sounds like they've put into working on this with you, they mustn't take everyone that actually tries to get published with them, because otherwise you just wouldn't have the time. So what was it like when you actually approached them and they actually said to you, well, basically this is something that we think we can work with and we would be interested in publishing this? Was that, because that must have been quite a big moment.
It was really, yeah, because yeah, I guess they obviously have their own process through which they, review books, and they need to kind of scrutinize and examine whether it's, worthy for the market. And yeah, I think something that really differentiates my book from others, without wanting to blow my own trumpet, is the fact that it's a really well-researched book. It's got over 100 footnotes. There's a lovely note that the proofreader of my book sent to me where she speaks about the research and the kind of analogies and so on that I use. So I guess it took a week or so for me to receive that response back from Troubadour. They took their time to kind of really examine and scrutinize it, but I think they could see that there's a need in the market for kind of beginner investors. Unfortunately, in the UK, I still do feel like we're a little bit behind in terms of other countries, particularly the US, in terms of financial literacy. And yeah, I think they could definitely see there's a market for this book. And it's been nice actually, because several members of the Troubadour team have even said that they'll be buying a personal copy. I won't mention her name, but there was one particular young lady who's been helping me along the way, and she said her boyfriend's going to buy a copy. So yeah, it's been great. I think one of the key things that I wanted to do at a book as well is just to kind of demystify investing. So I think the problem with too many books is that they're crammed full of jargon, and that can be quite off-putting, particularly for people that kind of don't want to spend too much of their time investing. I think that's like 99% of people actually just want to get on with their life. They don't want to kind of be thinking about investing too much. So I think that's something that Troubadour could really see, the language in which it's written. I tend to use a lot of analogies and metaphors and so on. So I think that's what really appealed to Troubadour.
When it came back and they had sort of proofread it for that first time, were there any changes or suggestions that they'd made where you maybe wouldn't have thought of it yourself, but then looking back, you think it's maybe really added something to the book?
Gosh, that's a good question. There were not too many. I'm quite a humble guy by nature. I don't want to come across as arrogant, overconfident. I really don't. But there were not too many, to be honest. Maybe it was just some things here and there about, the presentation of footnotes, for example. Didn't have much idea there about where I naively, footnotes at the end, but they wanted footnotes at the end of chapters and so on. I guess, for example, I tend to, with most chapters, have something called Mr. Sloth's summary. In some chapters, I'd forgotten to do that. So for consistency, they mentioned, well, if you're going to do that with some chapters at the end, then it's worthwhile doing it for the sake of consistency to ensure that, the chapters have a Mr. Sloth summary. I guess as well, thinking back now, one or two of the chapter headings were a bit lengthy. So they advised me to make them a bit more concise and snappy. So yeah, and here and there, I guess, thinking about it, here and there were sections where to kind of break up and make it a bit more chunkier, they gave me suggestions for a few more subheadings here and there. But I would say by and large, Troubadour were fairly happy with how the book looked. But yeah, there were those initial few suggestions, yeah.
So it was more detail then rather than anything fundamental to it.
Yeah.
So in terms of if you were to go and compare the published version now to say that first draft you submitted, in terms of the core of what's in there, that doesn't sound like it's changed a huge amount.
No, not really. I wouldn't say so, no.
Okay, I think that's everything on my side. So obviously, best of luck with the book release. And thank you very much for coming back on the show. Is there anything else that you would like to say or discuss before we wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, people always talk to me, for example, about, what if I could devise, or replace another bedrock principle, for example? Would I have an alternative word for one of my bedrock principles? And I guess O is obviously owning the world, having a broadly diversified portfolio. But for me, O as well would also represent optimism. So I think, I'm someone who tends to kind of keep abreast of the headlines and news, and I follow geopolitics and so on and so forth. And I think sometimes, particularly if people spend too much time on social media, it can be very tempting to think, oh man, what's going on in, whether it's the Middle East or the Far East or wherever it may be, or to worry about contemporary politics and so on. But I think just to kind of, for your listeners, for your audience, just to always remain optimistic. And that's going back to what you asked earlier about what I learned from the people on my podcast, particularly J.L. Collins and Andrew Hallam. Something that I think comes shining through in both of my episodes with them is that enduring sense of optimism that they have about the future, for example. So for me, that would be, a key ingredient of successful investing, through the good times and the bad. Just remember that kind of stock chart that we tend to see in terms of yes, it goes up and down from time to time, but over a multi-decade time horizon, the stock market does go up. So I would say, as a final point on this episode, just to continue to remain optimistic and just stay the course, keep on investing.
Obviously, we've already talked about the book and the podcast. Just finally to wrap up, where can people find you in terms of your social media and stuff like that?
Oh, thanks, Sam. That's a great question. So on X, which is formerly Twitter, so on X, my handle is @Sloth_Investor. That's @Sloth_Investor. I'm on YouTube as well, like I mentioned, and my YouTube handle is @The Sloth Investor. And within the last few years, I've become someone who's been contributing quite a bit of writing on Substack as well. So my Substack address is theslothinvestor.substack.com. So I'm tending to write an article every 2 weeks on Substack as well. And if you follow me on Substack, if you become a subscriber, then you'll be able to kind of keep up to date with my book release, my episodes on YouTube and so on. So they're the 3 key ways that people can kind of keep up to date with me. And I guess for the listeners in the UK in particular, key way to purchase my book would be on amazon.co.uk. It's already up there already, so you can check it out on amazon.co.uk.
Right, well, thank you once again for coming back on the show, and best of luck with the book release.
Thanks, Sam. It was great. I really enjoyed the discussion, and keep on investing like a sloth, everyone. Thanks ever so much.
Thank you for listening to The Investor Way. To get in touch, please follow us on Twitter @TIWTweets. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only and does not constitute financial advice. Neither Sam nor Jonathan are financial advisors. For investment advice, please consult professional advisors.